We're receiving a visitor to the station. She's a new Starfleet ensign and the first of her species to join, though that comes with additional requirements. Ensign MELORA is from a low-gravity world, you see, and that means just existing in 1G or thereabouts is a struggle. That's why Bashir's replicated a chair built to her specification, and dodges why we're not using an anti-gravity unit by saying it's incompatible with Cardigan structures. That this also means the show doesn't have to spend extra money on special effects is just a happy coincidence. This does raise some logistical issues regarding station construction, though. O'Brien's been nipping around installing ramps where possible, saying the Cardigans didn't give it any thought when they built the place. That feels a bit rich, for reasons we'll go into in the summary, but let's leave it for now. There are still plenty of places she won't be able to access, and she refuses to be teleported everywhere, only accepting accommodations for anything absolutely necessary. The only space where she'll feel truly at rest is her quarters, which O'Brien has set up to switch to zero gravity on request. Bashir's looking forward to meeting her and considers her extraordinary, and we could probably have a conversation about why considering people with disabilities as inspirational is problematic, but that's a whole video. Sounds like she doesn't have much time for it herself. She's abrupt with them both, and displeased that Bashir modified the design of her chair without asking. She also tries to argue against anybody coming with her on her survey mission and says she's a perfectly good pilot, though expecting her to be let through the wormhole on her own with one of only 3 megashuttles is a touch optimistic. They arrive at her quarters, and she offers thanks as she enters, leaving them on the other side of a now closed door. Quark's helping return some cultural artifacts to their homeworld and adjusting his price upwards as a result, but bugger all of that. Another visitor has just arrived for him, and one that sets him on edge. Quark offers the newcomer a drink in a glass, which would probably be better served with a straw based on his facial configuration, and attempts at small talk don't go so well, as the guy abruptly tells Quark that he's here to kill him. Let's leave them to it and switch to ops. MELORA arrives to find Dax and Bashir with Cisco and is annoyed at not being included, which is more than a little presumptuous for an ensign. Cisco seems to agree and tells her that it was a briefing by his officers, causing her to apologise, well, sort of, and explain that she's used to being considered a problem. Her lore dump about this being all she's ever wanted and fighting the hardship to achieve it is pretty much what you'd expect, but it's also resulted in her preferring to work alone. She says as much to Cisco, twice, but he's not willing to let her go through the wormhole alone. I'd probably have specified that's the same treatment as he'd give any ensign, but that's just me. Maybe Starfleet hadn't invented the 2-person away mission rule that Tuvok quotes in Voyager by this point. Bashir visits her quarters later, perhaps thinking a less formal setting will be more productive. Attempts at conversation are deftly batted away by her, but to her surprise, he bluntly points out what she's doing by attacking him to create distance. Sounds like she's not used to having people fight back, and maybe that's why she agrees to have dinner with him. Quark's trying to butter up his death threat visitor, and he's pulling out all the stops. It's not working, though, and the guy mentions an old debt, but at least he's not doing any actual killing while he's being distracted, so it's not a total loss. He's not the only person dining. Bashir and MELORA's visit to Deep Space Nine's new Klingon restaurant is pretty successful, not least of which because she seems to be well versed in Klingon cuisine and manages to impress the chef. Bashir and MELORA are getting along well now. Bashir's talking about his past, which is either indulging in his favourite topic or deftly taking the attention away from somebody who doesn't enjoy it, depending on how generous you're being to him. The soundtrack breaks out some violins, just in case any viewers not paying attention haven't figured out it's more than just him being friendly. That's enough for one night, though, as she's got a mission in the morning and calls proceedings to a close. Dax visits MELORA's quarters in the morning to find her absent. The computer tracks her down to a storage area, and one without any ramps going over the raised lips that join corridors. She'd come here for a piece of equipment and fallen on the controls for the exoskeleton she wears, meaning she couldn't right herself. Dax helps her back up to her chair, which probably shouldn't have been done without checking for injuries, and we go to the infirmary. Bashir confirms there's no real damage, save perhaps her ego, and the away mission is rescheduled for the following day. MELORA's frustration causes Bashir to try and convince her that everybody on this station relies on the people around them, and she can do the same. Maybe that's why he also broaches the topic of medical intervention as he's walking her back to her quarters. He says there was some research a few decades back into treatments that allowed low-gravity natives to better tolerate high-gravity environments. It didn't work, but Bashir's a dab hand at the old medicine business, and science has come a fair way since then too. She invites him in when they reach her quarters, and he initially declines as he knows she'll want to turn down the gravity. After a little hesitation, she says she can do that with him there, and he agrees. He thanks her for letting him in, and based on how things are turning out, probably ends up saying something pretty similar later on in the evening. Time to visit the Gamma Quadrant for her survey mission. Discovering they both know a little about Vulcan music helps Dax and Melora get along better, which is perhaps why the latter asks if Dax thinks relationships in Starfleet can work. Dax thinks it's not easy, but has examples of it doing just that, and in the most unexpected circumstances. She's also sufficiently observant to know why Melora's asking. Her ultimate advice on the topic seems to be go for it, largely because there's not much alternative until you leave the service. Back on the station, Quark is having a chat with Odo. Attempting to placate his homicidal guest isn't making much headway, so he thinks it's time to involve the local Rozzers. Odo's already aware of the gentleman in question, a certain Fallet Cott who just got out of an 8-year stretch for smuggling. Quark was mentioned in the investigation too, but saw no charges, and the implications of that are quite obvious. Quark tells him about the death threats, and after only a little bit of banter, Odo says he'll look into it. Speaking of looking into things, Melora visits Bashir in the infirmary to invite him to lunch and finds him deep in research. He's been checking over the medical bobbins for adapting to stronger gravity and thinks he can make it work. Quark's problem customer has been brought in for a word by Odo. He denies the threat, but doesn't put a whole lot of effort into making it convincing. He doesn't need to. He's not done anything wrong. Yet. Odo makes his position clear of not much caring for Quark either, but that it's his job to prevent any unpleasantness. His piece said there's not much more he can do, and he lets the guy leave. Not the response Quark was hoping for, obviously, so after saying he'll keep a watch on the guy, Odo gives him a comm badge so he can call if anything kicks off. Okay, he might get there after Quark's already dead, but at least he'll catch the guy. To the infirmary, where we've decided dosing up Melora requires her being nude. Maybe he's worried rapid muscle growth will tear her uniform or something. That's probably a touch overcautious, though the treatment is having an effect, and she's shortly able to lift her leg without the use of her exoskeleton. It's apparently enough to let her walk to ops, and everybody's suitably impressed, mostly with Bashir. They're still circle-jerking when Melora reminds them she exists by saying she's struggling. That's to be expected, he says, as it's just the first round of treatments, and he re-enables her exoskeleton and takes her back to her quarters. She wants to rest when there, by which she means turning off the gravity, but that's a problem. Doing so may confuse her brain and cause problems with adapting to the standard environment here. If she wants to walk, she'll have to give up her wings. Quark's finished for the night and returning to his quarters. The lights don't work on command, and it takes him a couple of seconds to process the implications of that. He's prevented from making the call to Odo by his would-be murderer, so Quark turns to the one thing he didn't want to get involved in this conflict: his money. That deal from the start of the show is worth 199 bars of latinum, and Quark will hand it over in exchange for not doing a dead. His guest is listening, but thinks he can do better. Melora's getting dosed up again by Bashir, and he's sticking with the line that she needs to be nude for it. Not quite sure why, as the only items he removes are from her head, upper chest and arms, but let's ignore that for now. Anywho, she's complaining that having to sleep under the station's standard gravity made everything feel bloody awful. Bashir says that'll pass with more sessions, but it's still enough to make her ask what the point of no return is for her treatment. Being told you can't be in zero gravity isn't quite the same as experiencing the moment of wanting to and knowing that you can't. Bashir tells her it's not an option, not even briefly, as he thinks switching between the two could mess up her headmeat and affect her ability to function in either environment. She's got a couple of days before things become permanent though, so she still has some time to think. And time perhaps for a second opinion, or would that be multiple opinions based on the source? Melora tells Dax it was an easy decision until she started facing the reality of leaving her old life behind, and she would have to leave it entirely as she'd never be able to live on her homeworld again. Dax points out her parallels with The Little Mermaid because this is TV and that means you're not ripping something off if you mention the thing you're ripping off. Hollywood rules. Melora asks if she lived happily ever after, and I guess the answer to that rather depends on whether she prefers books or films. Quark's making his trade for cultural artifacts, and the money goes straight to his former accomplice. So too do the artifacts, with Quark protesting his innocence in all this to his customer. Guns become involved, and some pooping yellow happens, the result being a dead customer and 2 bags of loot for our now actual murderer. He's not carrying them though, not when he has a Quark for that. Actual murderer has made a boo-boo though. Firing a gun has alerted Odo, and he sends some lads to check it out. The ensuing firefight doesn't seem to consider Quark's presence. Maybe the weapons are on stun, or maybe they just know him. All that pooping pushes actual murderer and Quark to another docking port, the one to which Dax and MELORA have just returned. 1 hostage becomes 3, and they take off again. Calling doesn't work, so Sisko sticks a tractor beam on it instead. Hostage negotiations go pretty poorly, what with actual murderer shooting MELORA to prove his point. It works, and through the wormhole they all go. Not alone, though, as they're being followed. Sisko, O'Brien and Bashir are following in another megashuttle, though there's not much they can do, as O'Brien recommends against trying to teleport them off at warp speeds. Actual murderer wants Dax to shoot at the pursuing ship, but she tells him to bollocks. Threats to kill her don't work when she's the only pilot and knows it. Turns out she's not the only pilot, as MELORA is still alive. Dax sees her and thinks keeping actual murderer distracted would be a good idea, so starts talking about how Starfleet won't let this go. MELORA is able to turn off the gravity while he's busy, and during the confusion, she takes him out with M. Bison's signature move from Street Fighter. It's all over when Sisko and Bashir teleport aboard. They find the hostages all alive and a very smug Quark, possibly because he's still alive, but probably because he's realised he'll get his latinum back and keep the artifacts too. Back on the station, MELORA's wondering why she's not dead. The shot should have killed her, and Bashir thinks it's because of the treatment. Something that lets you survive getting shot would probably be very useful in combat situations, but Starfleet is dedicated to peace, so we're going to forget all about it and pretend it never happened. MELORA's also decided to knock these treatments on the head. It was fun and all, but she values who she is over who it would make her. That also heralds the end of their relationship, apparently, which seems unnecessary when it started before she was getting dosed up, but maybe she's heard about Plain Simple Garak and wants to give Bashir the chance to be happy. The only thing that would make it more final is some Klingon wailing, so we add that too while he plucks the station's tiniest violin, and we'll leave the viewer to wonder if that was an intentional joke. Until the next adventure. Alright, let's do the point we mentioned at the start then. O'Brien said the Cardigans didn't give much thought to accessibility, and that's pretty rich coming from a Starfleet lad. You could argue it's because he's been pampered on the Enterprise D with its lovely ramps on the bridge, but I'd point out that he spent most of his time in a teleporter room, the one that has steps leading up to the pads rather than being embedded into the floor. For giggles, I had to think about which starship bridges could be considered accessible. The only one off the top of my head was the Enterprise D, and that only gets half marks because the battle bridge in the lower section has stairs. To be fair, there are a few other exceptions I didn't remember, like the Raven seen in Voyager, but they're rare. Even the Defiant has chairs raised on steps. There are 47 Federation bridge variants listed on xustriciencia.org because, of course, there are 47, and the number of them without any steps totals 7. It's an even worse picture when you realise 5 of those are just alterations to the same set. All of which tells us the Federation doesn't give much thought to accessibility. Take that a step back into the real world, though, and it also tells us that Hollywood itself doesn't give much of a shit. We could slap all of the in-universe reasons we like on that and say mobility issues are all solved in the future, but we still have the overwhelming majority of Star Trek sets built so that an actor using a wheelchair can simply never access them. Disabilities were written out of stories at the very conception of the show and needed extra work to jury-rig them back in. That we have a story willing to address this is to its credit, but it's still a pretty grim thought. I suppose it's fitting, though, as it's an accurate representation of how the rest of the world tends to overlook such things. If you think that's an overstatement, go check if your front door is flush with the floor. If it's UPVC, there's a pretty good chance the answer's no. There's also a pretty solid chance that it's not something you've ever considered. A little reading on the topic tells me the original writer of the episode, Evan Carlos Summers, was a wheelchair user himself and was trying to make a story from his own point of view. The original draft apparently had others causing problems by trying to be overly accommodating, while MELORA just got on with stuff. He's on record as being disappointed by the way the script was rewritten to make MELORA more antagonistic, rather than just someone who's trying to exist in a world that doesn't give them any consideration. The irony of somebody rewriting his intent would be funny if it weren't so on the nose. The moral of these things, then, is that science fiction will always be limited by prevalent attitudes of the day, no matter how progressive it tries to be. That isn't a reason to not try, of course, but something to be aware of when we look back, and something we'll likely be reminding ourselves of a lot more when we get to earlier series. A couple of other bits for this one then, before we go. The main is probably that it's the first episode to make Bashir mostly likeable. The caveat, of course, is him caring about the treatment as much as the patient, another nod to that ego, but it's still an upgrade from him spending the whole episode as a horny sex pest. The last is Bashir again, but this time a line from him. When experiencing weightlessness in MELORA's quarters, he says, "I can't tell you how curious I was about this." Now, that's an odd line, because we have multiple references to cadets experiencing zero-G at the Academy. In fact, there's a whole course about zero-gravity combat training. It could be that he means in a domestic sense, I suppose, but that doesn't really make much sense. A bit like saying, well, I've ridden roller coasters before, but never one in Nebraska. Another reminder, perhaps, of the devil being in the details. When there are so many balls in the air at any given time, I think it's fair to allow for the juggler letting the occasional one hit the floor. End of episode. Well, what do you think?
It's certainly better than your previous attempts.
I can smell a butt coming. And yes, that was a dog joke.
Does it really need to be 23 pages long?
Well, I tried shortening it, but the editor said the new draft lacked essential context.
All I'm saying is maybe 10 pages about how the prophets will never forgive him if he can't forgive others might be laying it on a little thick.
I'm worried about his religious well-being. That actually makes me better than him when you think about it.
And that whole chapter on how it's affected you psychologically.
Sympathy vote, mate. Trust me, these humanoids are all about it.
It's supposed to be an apology letter. Do you really need the 3-page assessment on what it tasted like?
Oh, come on, that's one of the best bits.
And you realize this whole thing doesn't feature the words sorry or apologize at all. Like, not once, in the whole thing.
Yeah, but it's implied in every syllable.
You know how you were worried you were never getting out of here and I said you were wrong?
Yeah?
I may have underestimated certain variables. Woof.